Welcome back. This is the part 3 of the AF3111 Intermediate Accounting 2 Week 9 topics on fair value measurements and globalization. Just before the second break, we've covered everything that you know for market valuation as well as level of inputs, okay, the 3 level. And from now on, we're going to look at some special applications, all right, and then towards the end, we will look at globalizations as well. Let's go back to the slides on special applications. There we go. We are now on slide 16. And just before we look at some special applications, I'm just want to show you a little bit or tell you a little bit about the one of the valuation techniques a little bit more, right? Just before we move on, just recall your memory. And this is the income technique. And in income technique, that means we're going to use present values. So Hong Kong FRS 13 neither prescribe the use of a single specific present value technique or limits the use of the present value technique used to measure fair value to the techniques discussed previously. And the application guidance of Hong Kong FRS 13 sets out the general principles in using present value techniques and also with the considerations of risk and uncertainty. The following general principles would then be applied to the use of the present value techniques to measure fair value. Number 1, cash flows and discount rate should reflect assumptions that market participants would use when pricing the assets or liabilities. Okay, this is important, so they have to be reflecting the assumptions here. Market participants that remember they have to be independent as well, right? They are not related parties and they're willing to buy and sell within the market. And to avoid double counting or omitting the effect of risk factors, the discount rate should reflect assumptions that are consistent with those inherent in the cash flows. Assumptions about cash flows discount rate should be internally consistent. And now we're going to look at before I go back, look at the example, remember the fair value in this case would then be present values of all expected cash flows of a particular assets or liability. So you pick up a discount rate and discount them, then you will have the fair value. This is the income approach. And this so-called income approach or technique apply a lot in measurements of liabilities. So let's look at the applications of this present value technique, first of all, to a purchase of bonds first. So requirement, what is the fair value of the bond A at the date of the purchase? So bond A has a contractual right to receive 800,000 in year 1. There is an established market for comparable assets and information about those assets, including price information, is also available. Of those comparable assets, bond B has a contractual right to receive 1.2 million in year 1 and a market price of 1.083 million. It implies an annual market rate of returns of 10.8%. And then we know it, bond C, another comparable assets, has a contractual right to receive 700,000 in year 2 in 2 years and has a market price of 566,000, implies an annual market rate of returns of 11.2%. We consider in this example all 3 assets, bond A, bond B, bond C, are comparable with respect to risk. They have the same level of risk. Okay, so in fact now we have to work out the fair value of bond A at the date of purchase. Okay, so which one would you how do you work out this fair value of the bond A then? In what sense and how do we do it? Well, basically what we have to do first of all is we know it in terms of choosing bond B or bond C as a comparable asset. We know that by choosing bond B, we don't have much problem on the timing uncertainty because they were both were receiving some money in the year 1, right? However, in bond B, they will be receiving 700,000 in 2 years, which is different. And then on the basis of the timing of the contractual payments to be received, bond B is deemed more comparable as well to bond A, as I just mentioned previously. And using the contractual payment to be received for bond A, which is 800,000 in year 1, And the 1-year market rate derived from bond B is tend to be more comparable, so we use the 10.8% as the interest rate. And if we take 800,000 to be received in year 1, end of year 1, then we will divide it by 1.1081 plus R. Then in fact the fair value of the bond A today should be 722,000 in terms of fair value. Now that's the way how we determined the bond value using the present value techniques. Okay, I will show you how to use the fair value technique, the present value technique applied to liability later on as well. But let's look at a specific application or special applications to financial asset. Financial asset such as investment bonds, investment shares. The following shall be considered where a financial asset is being fair valued. 1. If a quoted item has a bid price, the price that the buyer is willing to pay, and the ask price, the price that the seller is willing to achieve, the price fair value within the bid and ask spread, such as at the bottom, right? Bid is 1.33449 and ask is 1.33457. In fact, as per Hong Kong FRS 13, it is possible to choose any price in between to be fair value of that item, that shares likely. Okay, so it could be any price within the bid and ask spread. And Hong Kong FRS does not preclude the use of the mid-market pricing. Okay, so even middle of the two price can be used as well. The use of a bid price for assets and ask price for the liability is also permitted but not required. And then the valuations of the unlisted equity investments involve significant judgment, and different valuation techniques are likely to result in different fair value. However, this does not mean that any of the techniques are incorrect. It is likely that the valuation will be based on some unobservable inputs as we expected, and as a result, the overall fair value will be classified as level 3 measurements. Now, after reading the 3 bullet points, notice that it seems to be we are having some guidelines, but the guidelines is not clear, because what we said here is, in fact, we can have any price in between, we can have any price like in the middle, and if it's an asset, we can use bid price, and liability, we can use ask price. So it creates a lot of different values, allowing the holder of the assets and liability to choose a value that, in fact, in turns may allowing or in fact results in profit manipulations. That's a problem, really. Okay, and then how about special applications to liability? Well, liability, both financial and non-financial, must be measured on the assumption that the liability would be transferred, not settled, to a market participant at the measurement date, and therefore a liability would remain outstanding, and the market participant would be required to fulfill the obligations. All right, so you are trying to measure the liability as if you transfer them. To obtain the fair value of the liabilities, the most direct way is to measure, of course, to have a quoted price from an observable market for the transfer of identical or similar liability at the measurement date. That is the ideal situations. If there is no such observable market for transfer of a liability, there must still be an observable market for such items if they are held by another party as assets. So if you cannot measure the liability direct, then you can imagine, right? If you are the one to issue a bond or shares, there must be another party willing to buy it in the market. So you can measure the asset fair value instead and treat it as the fair value of the liability, such as a loan is recognized as a payable by one entity, the borrower, and a receivable by another entity as the lender, and therefore you can simply measure the receivable fair value and treat it as the fair value of the loan, right? That's the way how to do it. So the measurements of the corresponding asset shall be in the following descending orders of preference. If quoted price of an asset is given, then use that one. If not, then quoted price for the market in a market that is not active, or finally use present value technique. The fair value of liability should reflect the effect of the non-performance risk, including any company's own credit risk. So it should be reflecting the company's credit risk positions, okay, in order to be picked up as the fair value of that particular liability to be used. right? So, and non-performance risk is the risk that an entity will not be able to fulfill an obligations, all right, credit risk. Okay, let's look at the example on measuring liability. We have two of them. Requirement is, what is the fair value of a debenture in the books of the company as at the 30th of June 2016? A, if the securities market is considered to be active. In the B case, if the security market is considered to be inactive. So on the beginning of the year, 1st of July 2015, the company issues 100,000 5% debentures and redeemable 4 years later at par. Okay, so we know the face value 100,000, coupon rate 5%, durations 4 years. These were bought by a variety of the investors, and the debentures were traded in the local securities markets. Okay, we don't know whether it is active or not active. Okay, but we were answering the questions based on the requirement in A and B later on. At the end of the accounting year, these securities were traded in an active market at 990 per 1,000 debentures, and the interest rate for similar liabilities in an inactive market at 30th of June 2016 is 6%. Okay, now after reading the last two sentences, we were given information as if they were traded in an active market, then it would be trade at 990. If they were in fact trade in a non-active, which means in active market, then we were given the interest rate. So let's work out the fair value of the debentures at the end of the first year, 30th of June 2016, when the market is active. Well, when the market is active, obviously the best way to measure the debenture must be based on the market price, which is $990 per 1,000 debenture. So in other words, in this case, we will measure fair value, right, based on the market price. So the company shall measure the debenture at fair value based upon the quoted market price at the year end. That means we would take 100,000 of the price of it divided by 1,000 first, and then multiply by 990. So in other words, 99,000 would then be the fair value of the debenture in the active market. However, if it is in an inactive market situations, what we have to do is we have to use the present value technique. So we know it will be redeemable 4 years later at par, and each year we're going to have 5% times 100,000, which means in fact what 2,000 to be the 20,000 rather would then be the value of the interest. So multiply by present value factor ordinary annuity, 3 years 6%. Okay, the reasons why we use 3 years, because we want to work out the year one figures, right? This is year one figures, and 4 years later is starting from 1st of July 15. So that's why 3 years. And 100,000 is the face value, present value factor, 3 years 6%. That gives 97,327. Okay, so in fact 5% times 100,000 is your interest payments, okay, per year for the remaining 3 years, and then plus the redemption value discount for 3 years, 6% as well. Example 2. What is the fair value of a legal obligation that A and that B must record in their financial statement at the date of the recognitions? Okay, so we are now looking at the provisions or liability figures. A and B individually enter into legal obligations to each pay 200,000 to X in 7 years in exchange for some goods. A has a very good credit rating and can borrow at 4%, and B's credit rating is lower. It can be borrowed at 8%. The exchange of goods is not traded in an active market. Okay, so what do we do then? In this case, obviously, we have to calculate the liability based on the interest rate that are related to the credit rating or credit risk of that company. So for A, A has a very good credit rating and the interest rate is 4%. In that case, you would then what? You would then take the 200,000 that would be payable in year 7 divided by 1.04%, to year 7, right, then this fair value of your liability would now be 152,000 for, for A to recognize it. And then for B, all right, B, we know it, the credit rating is lower, and therefore lower means, right, require more payment, interest, more higher level of interest. Therefore, we use the 8%. So 200,000 divided by 1.08% to the power 7, the value of the provisions figures or liability figures would then be what? 116,600. Okay, so we must pick the interest rate which reflects the credit rating or credit risk or non-performance risk of that company. Okay, so the two values are different, even though the amount and periods are the same due to different risk profiles of the two companies. Okay, finally, we'll look at disclosure then. There were a couple of disclosure information that were prescribed under Hong Kong FRS, okay, to be disclosed for fair value measurements. So this is one of the disclosure info. Okay, so I'm going to show you some example here. You can see that basically for each of the assets here, we have the trading equity securities, non-trading, corporate securities, IP, land held for sale, okay, which is non-current asset held for sale. And then we basically work out the fair value measurements, the figures that you report at the end of the financial period. Okay, and what you have to do is you would open up 3 columns here. Remember, they are notes disclosure, all right, and that means they won't be shown on the face of the statements of financial position. So this 3 column would then be a notes info. What you have to do is you have to inform the users of financial statement. In fact, this 45, which means the trading equity securities and the corporate securities, they are in fact level 1 inputs. They are observable inputs, likely to be quarter price input. However, the non-current land held for sale will be level 2, and then non-trading and investment property, in fact, they are level 3. So that means they are the most unobservable inputs, right? So when you were looking at it, you know, okay, which one is more certain than the others in terms of info here. All right. The company has measured land held for use sales at fair value on a non-recurring basis as a result of it's classified as held for sale. So anything non-current asset held for sale, they are not supposed to be, you have to do it or measure it every year, right? Usually, if they were held for sale, you expected to sell them within 1 year as per the definition. So that is why we call it non-recurring basis. Other than that, we have to provide information about the valuation process for level 3 fair value. So the company, say for instance here, the company engage a qualified valuers to determine the fair value of a group's financial instruments, and they're at level 3, okay, for every 6 months. And the fair value of the IP is also determined at the end of each reporting period. So you have to give more disclosure info, and you also have to disclose the effects of this change of fair value due to level 3 measurements fair value and on the P&L effects. So such as this. Okay, so you have the reporting here, right? So for the non-trading equity securities is about 1.2 million loss, and then IP is about a gain of 0.8. Overall is 0.4 loss. So on the face of a statement of the profit and loss, you may just show one number, right? But then you have to show the breakdown now in terms of level 3 fair value changes. Also, the techniques have to be disclosed as well. Okay, the following valuation techniques are used for different levels of inputs, such as level 1 for the equity and corporate securities, you use quoted share price. For level 2 land house sales, you would use the sales comparisons approach, which means sales price of a comparable land in similar locations and adjusted for differences in key attributes such as land size, and then the valuation model is based on price per square meter. And the other 2 are supposed to be measured based on level 3. So they would use the discounted cash flows method or present value approach. Okay, so I've just finished all the contents on the fair value measurement. Let's finish off by looking at globalisation. Globalisation, which is obviously not, in fact, under Hong Kong FRS 13. Okay, so we can look at globalisation. Why we have to look at globalization issues then? Because it is related to what happened, uh, or what would you expect it to be seen in the future of the development of the financial reporting standards. We all know it, right? With the advancement of the technologies over the years, we expect that there will be easy for anyone, any potential investor to buy shares, okay, in any companies located in whatever countries they are, right? And they can do it with very little costs. And because of that, it would be difficult for you, since you have many choice of investments, right? You have to compare. You should have the ability to compare the performance or financial positions of different companies located in different industry or in different countries. Okay, but you will all know it. In fact, most of the countries, they would have their own local accounting standards. So that makes comparisons difficult. So in view of that, it would be better that we have a global sets of accounting standards. One set of standards that can be used by all companies located in different countries. The idea was even brought up before we have the internet, where they're named in resolving and reconciling accounting differences. The IASC, the International Accounting Standard Committee, was established to promote such an harmonizations of accounting standards. The IASC also wants to, in fact, develop a global sets of accounting standards, but they did not do well. Okay, so they set up in the year 1973, and then in fact they restructure, and in the year of 2001, they rename it, call it now IASB, International Accounting Standard Board, to replace the predecessor. Okay, and then after that, right, they've developed standards in a way. Remember, we have Hong Kong AS and Hong Kong FRS, right? And Hong Kong AS will in fact is like a word-for-word versions of the International Accounting Standard IAS. IAS are in fact were in fact developed by the IASC, and then Hong Kong FRS in fact is a word-for-word versions of the IFRS, which is developed by the IASB. Okay, right. So both of them were in fact located in London. Okay, of course, ISC will no longer be exists. Okay, we only now have IASB, and they develop international financial reporting standards, which are supposed to be a global set of standards. And it is true. Okay, because nowadays it's only two mainstream of standards. It is either IFRS or US GAAP. Okay, so Hong Kong was one of the first jurisdictions to adopt IFRS back in the year 2005, and now we are one of the 144 jurisdictions as of 2018 April that require or permit IFRS for all or most domestic publicly accountable entities in their capital markets, listed and even financial institutions. All right, okay, let's move on. For this part, you only need to know two things. It's either development of the IFRS convergencies or the future challenges ahead using IFRS. So we're going to spend a little bit of time to just look at the development side of it. Everything starting from the year 2002. Remember, IFRS set up in the year 2001, and in the year 2002, which is 1 year later, the European Union, EU, commissions require all the listed companies in the European Union to adopt IFRS starting from the 2005. So that was backed up by the Europe, basically. Okay, any companies, listed company in Europe, they would be allowed, in fact, they would be allowed to adopt IFRS starting from the year 2005. And then 2003, okay, Australia, Hong Kong, New Zealand committed also to adopt the same IFRS, of course, using their own versions. So what they did is they would adopt the IFRS into their local standards, okay, word for word mostly. And in 2005, 25 countries in Europe switched to IFRS as well. And in year 2006, the IASB as well as the Financial Accounting Standard Board, which means the US, they agreed a roadmap for convergence between the IFRS and US GAAP. China also adopted accounting standards substantially in line with IFRS in name but not in substance at that time. 2007, Brazil, Canada, Chile, India, Japan, Korea established timelines as well to adopt or converge with IFRS. And stock exchange commissions in the United States also in that year removed reconciliations requirement for any non-US companies if they listed their shares in US to report under IFRS. So if they are non-US companies and they list their share in the stock exchange in the United States, right, they no longer need to comply with to prepare a reconciliations documents or reports, unlike before, right? So if this is a Hong Kong company and they listed their shares in the United States, they then have to do a reconciliation statements like reconcile profit based on the Hong Kong GAAP all the way adjusted to the profit after prepare under US GAAP. But that is removed, okay, as long as that company, a non-US company, using IFRS to prepare their financial statements. In the year 2009, the Ministry of Finance in China issued a exposure draft of a roadmap for continuing and full convergence of Chinese accounting standards for business enterprise, in short CASBE, with the IFRS. And 1 year later, 2010, Hong Kong Stock Exchange decided to allow mainland incorporated companies listed in Hong Kong to have an option to present financial statement using the Chinese accounting standard for a business enterprise and audited by approved mainland audit firm. So that you can see that we're increasing the recognitions of the international standards. Also, at the same time, we recognize the Chinese accounting standards as well. And then in the same year, the European Union's commissions permits Chinese issuers, Chinese companies to use the CASBE, Chinese accounting standard for business enterprise, when they enter into the Europe market without adjusting financial statements in accordance with IFRS endorsed by EU. And then the 2012, the Stock Exchange Commission in the United States requires companies to file their accounts financial statement under both IFRS and US GAAP for 2 years, 2012 up to 2014, after which financial statements will be prepared under IFRS alone. That's what they want to do it, right? And then that was actually not achievable at all. As you can see, 2 years later, the Stock Exchange Commission in the United States stepped backwards from its previous roadmap and is questioning whether a single set of global account standard can be achievable. So there was a little bit of restriction there. And then the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standard Board in the United States, is no longer committed to converge to the convergence project. Okay, so usually in the past, IASB and FASB, they come together and they prepare they issue financial statement, financial reporting standards together, right, through a convergency project. And in the year 2014, FASB decided no longer to commit to those projects, particularly project related to financial instruments and insurance contracts. So that means these days, the US GAAP will have their own versions of financial instruments and insurance contract standards. 2017, the IASB ignore the FASB. They develop the last standard so far, IFRS 17, from the Convergency Project. IFRS 17 is insurance contracts. And 2018, full convergence with the US GAAP is still not optimistic. However, IASB has commenced 3 new projects alone, namely disclosure projects, primary financial statements, goodwill, and impairment. So we would expect that in the future, those areas may be changed, okay? And that means we may have either new standards or revisions of old standards. And just last year, the AASB in Australia, okay, Australian Accounting Standard Boards, proposed developing standards to cover crypto assets. Okay, so cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and the others. And the IASB believes that such asset class may not be material enough to warrant full standard setting for the time being. So IASB still hasn't committed to develop any standard on that areas. But sooner or later in the future, we should expect that there will be standards for crypto assets. Okay, that's everything for development. How about last one? last slides on future challenges. There are challenges ahead, right? By adopting or by introducing the IFRS to different companies, in different parts of the world, in order to achieve harmonization. There are also always challenges. Number one, historical accounting differences may not be reconciled or removed simply by the adoptions of the IFRS, such as, for instance, IFRS does not allow LIFO for inventory measurements, but US GAAP allows it. And also, some of the related party transaction standards may not be considered to be adoptable from countries such as Japan, Korea, or even China. Okay. However, we do have such a standard in IFRS. And then corporate failures such as Enron and Barings have significant change the regulatory framework on business, including accounting. And failure occurred may still affect the practice of IFRS, and change seems to be inevitable. Okay, so it is possible that we may have constant change, right? So that is something that we should expect it to see even in the future. Although in the past couple of years there hasn't been much change, except that we have new standards coming up, such as insurance contract. The experience in applying IFRS is still very limited. As you can see, actively we have new standards starting from the year 2001, right? So our app experiences in terms of applying them are still limited, okay? And the process of experience accumulations may still take time, so future change in IFRS may still occur. Okay, and ISB is only an independent body responsible to issue interpret IFRS, but it does not have a mechanism to resolve any application dispute. So an inconsistent application or misapplication issues around the world is always still a problem. Number 5, in case of dispute, there is no international organizations with a power to enforce IFRS and assure the entity using IFRS are really in compliance with IFRS. So that is still a big issue. And finally, fair value accounting required in certain IFRS was blamed as a cause that, in fact, causing all the financial problems in a crisis in the world, particularly in the year 2008 for the global financial tsunami. And the ISB was forced to immediately address the demands of certain commercial and political parties, such as IFRS 9, or if you like Hong Kong FRS 9 for financial instruments, was issued to replace the old standard IAS 39 in stages. And then IFRS 13, the one that you've learned today, Hong Kong FRS 13 equivalent, was issued to provide additional guidance on fair value measurements. That means we are having a lot of pressures, okay, on ISB. So that seems to be inevitable. So I think you can see that, in fact, it's very challenging to have a global set of accounting standards, both in terms of application and also the way how to ensure the implementation will do well. Okay, but that is the status that what we have now, and we do expect that there will be changes, major changes in the future. Okay, I think that's about it for this week. You've learned quite a lot, I'm sure. Okay, make sure that you do the questions and prepare for the live tutorial session. Okay, and I'll see you next week for week 10 and one more week, week 11. 2 more weeks to go. Okay, that's it. See you. Bye.